Cowboy expected a simple bride. But the beauty who came made him fear his own passion. That was the truth of Thomas Granger's life on the day the stagecoach rattled into the small frontier town of Willow Creek. Thomas was a man of few words, his life defined by long hours of ranch work, the creak of saddle leather, and the endless wind across the plains. For years he had lived in silence, the walls of his cabin filled only with the echo of his own footsteps. When he sent away for a mail-order bride, he pictured a plain woman, someone practical, who knew how to sew and cook, who would not stir in him feelings too dangerous to touch. He wanted company, not fire, a partner in survival, not a spark that might ignite all he had locked away. Yet when the stagecoach doors opened, and a woman stepped down into the dust of the street, Thomas felt the earth shift beneath him. Elena. That was her name, spoken softly as she introduced herself, and it rolled from her lips like music. She was unlike any woman the rancher had imagined. Her dark hair gleamed under the sunlight, her eyes shone with untamed fire, and her presence alone seemed to hush the town around her. Thomas stood frozen, his hat clenched in his hands, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years. This was no simple bride. This was beauty personified. And with it came a danger greater than any storm on the plains. The danger of awakening a passion he had long buried. He offered his hand, his voice rough and uneven as he said her name. And when she smiled faintly, Thomas knew his carefully built walls were about to crumble. The wagon ride back to Thomas's ranch was long, the road winding through rolling hills and open prairie. But the silence between them was heavier than the sky before a storm. Thomas kept his eyes fixed ahead, the reins steady in his hands. Yet every part of him was aware of Elena seated beside him, her perfume faint but intoxicating, her posture proud though her journey had clearly wearied her. He had expected shyness, hesitation, perhaps even fear, yet Elena carried herself with quiet strength, her gaze moving across the endless horizon as though she had known wide-open spaces her whole life. Thomas stole glances at her, his heart thundering like hooves, and with each stolen look came the same fear. He was not ready for this. He wanted someone plain, someone who would not stir emotions that could make him reckless. But Elena was anything but plain. She was fire wrapped in flesh, and he could already feel the heat. As they reached the ranch, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in molten gold, casting shadows across the wooden house that stood solitary against the land. Thomas helped her down, their hands brushing briefly, and the touch sent a shiver racing through him. He cleared his throat, muttered something about showing her the house, and led her inside. The cabin was simple, sturdy, filled with the scent of wood smoke and leather. Elena walked slowly, her fingers tracing the mantel, the table, the old rocking chair, her expression unreadable. Finally she turned to him, her dark eyes locking onto his. "This will be home?" she asked, her accent lacing the words with music. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. He busied himself with chores, lighting the fire, fetching water, anything to escape the intensity of her gaze. Yet every time he looked up, she was watching him, and he felt stripped bare, as though she could see past the walls he'd built. That night, as they sat across from each other in silence broken only by the crackle of the fire, Thomas realized the battle had already begun, not against Elena, but against himself, and deep down he feared he would lose. The days that followed unfolded like a slow-burning fire, each moment drawing Thomas closer to the edge of something he both longed for and feared. Elena slipped seamlessly into the rhythm of ranch life, though her every action seemed to transform the world around her. When she carried water from the well, the sun caught in her hair until it looked like strands of midnight silk. When she knelt in the garden to pull weeds, her hands seemed too delicate for the rough earth, yet her determination made the flowers bloom brighter. And when she sang softly to herself while mending clothes, her voice floated like a prayer across the empty plains. Thomas tried to harden himself against it, throwing his strength into work from dawn to dusk, riding out with the cattle, repairing fences, fixing the barn roof, anything to keep from being near her too long. But no labor could tire his heart enough to quiet it. At night, the silence of the cabin grew heavier, broken only by the crackling fire and the brush of Elena's movements as she sat near the hearth, her face glowing in the flickering light. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and in that brief connection, Thomas felt as if the earth itself trembled. One evening, while a storm brewed in the distance and thunder rumbled low, Elena spoke at last, her voice soft but steady. "Why do you avoid me?" she asked, and Thomas froze, his hands tightening on the mug of coffee he held. He muttered something about work, about being tired, but Elena's gaze cut through his excuses like a knife through rope. "You fear something," she said gently. "But it is not me, is it?" Thomas could not answer, for his heart pounded with the truth. He feared himself, the passion that roared inside him whenever she was near, the wild hunger he thought he had buried forever. He turned away, staring into the fire, his jaw clenched. Elena rose, moved closer, and placed her hand lightly on his arm. The touch was soft, yet it burned hotter than the flames. "Thomas," she whispered, "you do not need to fight what is already yours." His breath caught, the storm outside crashing closer, but it was nothing compared to the storm within. In that moment, Thomas knew his walls were crumbling, and soon nothing would be able to hold back the night the storm finally broke was one Thomas would never forget. Rain came down in sheets, drumming against the cabin roof like 1,000 pounding hooves, and the wind howled through the cracks, rattling shutters, shaking the very bones of the house. Thomas had been outside all day, battling the storm to secure the cattle and make sure the barn would hold, his body aching from the fight against wind and mud. By the time he stumbled back inside, dripping wet, Elena was waiting by the fire, her eyes glowing like embers in the dim light. She rushed to him, laying a blanket across his shoulders, her hands lingering longer than they needed to, and in that moment Thomas felt his control unravel. He stepped back, shaking his head, his breath uneven. "I can't," he rasped, his voice rough from the storm and from the war raging inside him. Elena's brows furrowed, her lips parting as she searched his face. "You can't what? Care for me? Allow yourself to feel? Or is it that you're afraid you already do?" Her words struck like lightning, illuminating the truth he had tried so hard to bury. He clenched his fists, water dripping from his hair, his chest rising and falling as though he'd run miles. "You don't understand," he whispered harshly. "Passion ruins everything. It takes, it burns, and it leaves you with nothing but ashes. I can't go down that road again." Elena stepped closer, undeterred, her hand lifting to touch his cheek. The tenderness of her fingers against his rough skin was more powerful than any storm. "Then let it burn, Thomas," she said softly. "Because life without love is colder than any ashes." "You think you're protecting yourself? But what you're really doing is dying slowly, piece by piece." The rain hammered harder, thunder split the sky, and in that moment Thomas could no longer hold back. He grabbed her hand, pressed it against his heart as though to prove how violently it beat, and then pulled her into him, their lips crashing together in a kiss that tasted of rain and fire and years of loneliness. The storm outside raged on, but inside, another storm consumed them, one of passion, of fear, of surrender. Thomas felt as though he had been set free and chained all at once, terrified of the depth of what he felt, yet unable to resist it. As the fire roared higher and the rain battered the walls, Thomas knew there was no going back. The beauty who had arrived at his doorstep was no longer a stranger. She was the woman who had awakened his heart, and for the first time in years, he was alive. Morning came with a stillness, so profound it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. The storm had passed, leaving the prairie washed clean, the air sharp and fresh with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Thomas stirred before the fire, the embers glowing faintly, and for a moment he thought he was still dreaming, for Elena lay beside him, her dark hair spilled across his chest like a silken river, her hand resting lightly over his, hard as though she belonged there. He stared down at her, his throat tight with awe and fear all at once, realizing that nothing in his life had ever felt so right and nothing had ever terrified him more. For years he had built walls around his heart, convinced that love was too dangerous, too consuming, but now those walls were nothing but rubble, and in their place stood a woman who had shown him that passion was not destruction, but creation. When Elena stirred and her eyes opened, she looked at him not with triumph or demand, but with gentleness, as if she knew the war he had fought within himself. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," she whispered, her voice steady in the quiet morning. Thomas swallowed hard, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his calloused fingers trembling with tenderness. "I thought love would break me," he confessed, "but I think living without it was what truly broke me." Elena smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds, filling the cabin with light. They rose together, stepping outside into the damp earth, And as Thomas looked over the wide-open land, he no longer saw loneliness stretching endlessly before him, but a future where the house would echo with laughter, where his days would no longer be defined by silence, but by the voice and presence of the woman beside him. He knew the road would not be easy, that storms would come again, that passion might test him in ways he feared, but he also knew he was no longer alone. Taking Elena's hand, he led her to the corral, introducing her to the horses, and as she stroked their manes with gentle confidence, he realized she was not just beauty, she was strength, fire and hope woven into one. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with fire, Thomas sat on the porch with Elena at his side, and for the first time, he allowed himself to dream of children running through the fields, of love filling the air as thick as the scent of wildflowers. He had expected a simple bride, a quiet partner to share in survival, but what he had been given was something far greater. A woman who made him fear his own passion, only to teach him that passion was not the enemy, but the heartbeat of life itself. And so, dear friends listening to this tale, if this story has touched your heart, if it has reminded you that love can break walls you never thought would fall and turn fear into strength, then do not forget to subscribe to the channel, because many more stories of courage, passion, and second chances are waiting for you. Each one a reminder that even the loneliest cowboy can find his dawn.